After graduation, Larry and Vince shook hands and parted as friends, as they would be, knowing each other for the rest of pretty much eternity. They simply tipped their hat to their associate lady friends, which, surprisingly, Femcast and Greknar both went and hugged the other. They were surprised at this, as this was a strictly human gesture. Greknar would simply usually rub her face on the side, kind of cheek to cheek. And Femcast had this strange bowing ritual, almost like a mix between a bow, a curtsy, and a squat. It was very strange, but instead they both decided to hug the opposite male. This was surprising, and then they hugged each other. Again, surprising the holy crap out of Larry and Vince. Vince took Femcast to their shuttle, and she was more than a little interested to get back onto his ship. She was impressed by the mechanics, by the engineering of such a vessel. Not to mention what she really found interesting is when he gave the command to uncloak. This was just something she didn't understand, as this was a human phrase. Lower the drawbridge, Vince would yell out, and then not only would the ship suddenly come into view, but she could see that the bay would open up almost instantaneously once it was in full view. This was just shocking to her. She knew that the AI inside was definitely helping out, but she was a little put back at the executive officer that was there. She was surprised that this one that Vince called Tex was kind of mean to her. It would never harm her. She knew that, but she also knew that if given the order, this android would go down and raise all sorts of holy hell. She didn't worry about it too much, as she stayed close to Vince the whole time. He was basically grinning the whole time as he set the ship up to leave the area and head towards Femcast's home world. And as they left, he unhooked himself from the autopilot and made sure that an alarm would go off if there was something that was needed. And then they proceeded to not even make it to their own quarters. In fact, the AI had to interrupt them and say how she did not want to send the cleaning drones again, and that they should find a room. With this, Vince picked up his skinny little girlfriend and carried her in. Femcast always did like the fact that Vince was very large and very strong. This made her turn many shades of red, almost purple, although this was something that always made Vince worry, especially recently. He knew what the species had started to do, mixing in with all the humans' technology. The humans, only at the embassy, would allow those to be transformed, to adjust their bodies, to transmutate into a new form that was very similar to humans, however, leaving all the extra parts that still showed their species. The only issue is, by his own eyes, they were very difficult to tell apart. Though he would never get Femcast confused with anyone else. It would be very, very difficult outside of the different shading to tell them apart, as they were almost all the same height, only separated by maybe 1 or 2 centimeters at most. This was odd. There was very little sexual dimorphism between the males and the females. The only way to tell was that the males tended to be of a more robust complexion, either being a kind of almost royal blue or purple, a bright purple. But this purple also was something you would find in females. So he worried that any time he saw Femcast blush with her deep blue skin mixing in with the red blood, she did turn a little purple and he got nervous. He always had to think to himself, I better check to make sure nothing's changed. Femcast didn't mind this at all, as she enjoyed it very, very, very much. Upon arriving on the fourth planet in their system, Vince had to adjust course, as he had said that they were going to head to the homeworld, but Femcast was not born on the cradle world, but her homeworld. Sometimes you have to be very specific when it comes to AI. The fact of the matter is, she was born on one of the moons on the sixth planet. This was fairly common, as most spacefaring races have colonies, and of course colonies are going to continue to grow. As they landed, with the shuttle, not the ship, of course. The ship being way too large to enter an atmosphere without being stuck on the planet, without ripping it to pieces on the way up, they were immediately surrounded by Femcast's family. They were surprised to see her, and many of them, especially the young ones, commented on how much taller she was. By her own species standard, of course, she was a bit taller. However, she didn't mind this much, as her body had basically stretched out, making her look extremely thin, yet certain parts of her were very, very robust, at least to their eyes. To human eyes, this would be commonplace and not considered all too, shall we say, excessive at all. In fact, this was what Femcast wanted, was to show off her new body to her family, even though some of them did not like the fact that she'd altered herself to be more human. They were on a garden/ocean world, of course. Vince wanted to go and enjoy the beach and didn't enjoy the water as much, but he was a bit put back at the idea that if he entered the water, then perhaps something would simply come up and snag him. He was a little more than intrepid about this, as it seemed as though everyone there would simply strip off their outer layer of clothing, if they even wore it, and go straight into the ocean. This let him know exactly who was on which side of the slider, whether they were male or female, very, very quickly. He noticed that each of them seemed to not care, which was nice, although when he started stripping off his clothes, everyone seemed to stop and stare. They had not seen a human directly. They were surprised. They saw how muscular a human was, and Vince was a very large specimen. He had made sure that when his body was altered, it maintained his actual peak performance. He was always going to be muscular and strong, standing tall even for a human. And yet, everyone there was skinny and small, and he worried about what was going on. He looked for a suit, and everyone was like, "What the hell is a bathing suit?" Of course, he had to explain that. And eventually, he would sit there on the beach and just enjoy the view. He enjoyed the view, of course, of his girl, and he enjoyed the view of the others as they played. Not that he was going to sit there and simply point north the whole time. No, he had more control than that, most of the time. Whenever Femcast came up and, of course, sat next to him, yeah, straight on to stage 2 as far as male biologics go. For about a week, they didn't hear anything, and eventually they received a message from the Nishani Council. The Nishani Council was a planetary council that also was linked up with their own species' larger council. The planetary council wanted to talk to Vince in regards to his ship. They knew that it was a very large and powerful ship, as most human ships are, and they wondered if he was willing to stay there and watch over them. They weren't sure about this, as they had received an offer, a very good offer, to go back to the academy. And Vince would be one of the instructors. Larry, of course, had already taken up this position, one of them at least, and Vince would be covering the other one. He wondered, should he stay? Should he return? He didn't know. He sat down with the council and, of course, with Femcast, but what they said actually surprised the living crap out of him. They were planning on making a new type of military, at least a new group. This would be similar to that of Special Forces or Delta Force. Officially, they don't exist, yet it would be very easy to point them out in a crowd. Vince did not understand the joke, even though a few of them seemed to cackle and laugh at this. He was confused. As it turned out, the Nishani had been talking with the humans, and the humans had allowed another ship to land. Even though they weren't allowed to see all the ways that their bodies were going to be altered, if someone decided to change, then they would definitely be allowed to. Of course, the Nishani were paying very well for this, and they realized that they could bring more and more visitors as they realized that their new bodies were very attractive to humans, males and females. And of course, there was also the money. They were going to pay Vince a hell of a lot of money to keep his ship in orbit as a deterrent from anyone to entering their space. With Femcast basically begging, not quite on her knees, but pretty damn close, for him to stay and to consider it, he did. As he watched, he saw that the other human ship that was going to be allowing people to change was small enough that it could land on this colony. As it did, he was there to greet them, let them know that he would be taking over the training regiment for these new ones. They weren't hiding anything. Of course, the human delegation didn't care. They were getting paid for this. Their only mission was to adjust the locals if they wanted to, and then receive payment and leave. They would only be there for a year. Over the next few months, Vince watched as things changed. Yes, it was getting difficult to pick Femcast out of a crowd, especially if she wasn't looking at him. But he realized that the Nashani were not all changing. Many of them wanted to make sure they maintained their original form. This was of no consequence to anyone else. But what was of consequence was in Vince's job. When he first showed up, he realized that each of them wearing some strange sort of biomechanical stretchy suit, which almost looked as though it was some sort of strange cat suit they were all wearing. He didn't understand, but apparently this was their idea of an exosuit, a way to increase their mobility, increase their strength without actually adjusting themselves too much. They did not like big bulky suits. Their bodies were not designed for that, nor would be able to keep up with the pressure. Yet, as he walked in and called them all to attention, he looked all them over and realized, oh, I'm in trouble. I'm in deep trouble. He didn't voice this, but he realized that they all were giving him a certain look, a look that he knew all too well thanks to his woman, and he worried about this. He knew he would have to stay as professional as possible, and worried about that because he hated being professional. He truly did. Yet he knew he had a job to do. Looking at each of them, he began to go through each of their profiles to make sure everything was up and up. Everyone was where they were supposed to be, and he had everyone. And with that, he started the training. And the training was difficult. The training itself was surprisingly harsh for a Nishani, but it wouldn't be anything that a basic trainee for humans couldn't handle. They couldn't believe the amount of pressure they had to put their bodies in. Some of them actually hinted at the idea of giving Vince a quick go round in exchange for him to go easier, which backfired fantastically as he made sure that he exercised them for the entire night. Everyone was doing things that they had never heard about, front, back, and goes for over 3 hours, and then push ups for another hour. Doing something called a flut or kick was just done for an hour, hour and a half until they were all screeching in pain. Vince not even giving a crap. All he knew is that he needed to get home as soon as it was over, because watching these very attractive blue and purple folks sweating profusely, groaning as they spread their legs out and moved around and stretched, well, he needed to find his woman. Femcast didn't seem to mind it, as every time Vince returned home, she would already be ready. And this led to another instance, another problem. Femcast was looking towards having children, but she didn't tell Vince. She knew that her mating cycle was coming up, which only happens about a dozen times in their lifetime. But now that she had been altered, she wondered if the mating time would be changed, extended, shortened, if it would even happen. If it started, would it stop? She worried about this because once she started within her cycle to have children, she didn't know if it was the right time, but they were set up pretty good. As Vince came home, she literally would jump on him, and it became a game. It became a very interesting game for them. Vince, being the excellent trainer he was, realized what was going on, so he would try to sneak into the house and try to find her before she found him. He realized that this game worked out really well, and they would play something similar as a training exercise with those he was training, trying to find those in a basic version of hide and go seek. This was before they started using weapons, and of course, the paint rifles. However, in the house, one day Vince walks in and he smells something very sweet. He thought something was being cooked in the kitchen, but the kitchen was cold and the lights were off. He moved around the bottom floor, very sneaky and silently. He didn't find anything. He knew Femcast was home, but more and more, he snuck around, couldn't find her. As quietly as he could, he checked all the closets. He checked underneath the chairs, the sofa, and everything. She could wiggle herself into some of the strangest places. As he went up to the second floor, he began to look around more and more, still couldn't find her. Listening close for any type of movement. Nothing. Nothing was moving. Nothing was breathing. What was that? He thought to himself. Oh, I think she's upstairs. But before he moved upstairs, he kept moving around, checking all the second floor. Nothing on the second floor. There was only one left. There was two ways up and down. He knew that if someone went up or down the stairs, he'd be able to notice. There's no way of hiding that. He crept upstairs, and he looked over and he saw that the doorway to the master bedroom was open. He saw some sort of fabric, a new type of fabric was on the bed. This caught him a little off guard. What the hell? Taking a few steps forward, suddenly jumped onto something and grabbed him down, pulled him down to the floor, and as Vince flipped over, suddenly he was face to face with his wife. She had a look in her eyes that was unmistakable, but the surprise was the fact that the irises in her eyes had changed color. What the hell, he thought, but he didn't have time to think, as she began to rip at his clothes, so much so that she actually started to rip into his flesh. He didn't have to worry about it. All he could think of is, whoa, ambush predator! She's got me! She's got me! After everything was over, Femcast told Vince she was starting her mating cycle and he might want to take a few days off of work. He asked why, and she simply said, "Because I'm not going to allow you to leave this house." With that, Vince simply grinned. He was able to very slowly reach over to grab his communicator and contacted the one in charge of the building. He simply stated to those that were on guard to put out to everyone that for the next 5 days, they would be on their own. This would be rest and recuperation for them. He recommends that they stretch their muscles and be ready for the next round of training, but he was unable to make it. With that, he could hear cheers in the background, as he knew others could hear this. Those that he had trained were suddenly happy that they could have a few days off. The one on the other side said, "Excuse me, sir, but are you ill or something? Do we need to get the biofilters out?" No, that won't be necessary." "Well, sir, if it's a biohazard contaminant, then we really need to worry about it because we understand that you humans only go down if you're ill or if you're injured. Are you injured?" "No, I'm not injured. I'm not hurt. Will you just take the win already?" "But, sir, we need to follow protocol." With that, Femcast grabbed the communicator, showed her face right to him, and go, "He's going to be busy," and then pulled the communication device back to expose that she was not wearing anything. "You get it yet?" Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And the call ended. With that, Femcast literally launched the communicator down the hallway, got on top of Vince and said, "Round two." And Vince responded, "Ding, ding." Femcast had no idea what the hell he was talking about, but it didn't take long. 6 days later, he showed up at the unit as they all stood there waiting for him, and he looked horrible. He looked like somebody had beat the living crap out of him and not let him sleep for the past week, which he didn't. And after morning physical training, he was in his office taking care of some paperwork when one of the other Nishani came in, one of the commanders, and simply said, "So, I guess we should schedule you." Vince said, "What are you talking about, scheduling? Schedule me for what?" "Well, in about 6 months, I have a feeling you're going to be very busy." "Why? What happens in 6 months?" Without skipping a beat, the commander goes, "Oh, humans